Welcome and thank you for attending this panel. My paper is entitled The Development and Rise of Oromo Transnationalism, Past and Present. The cross-border flow of information, networks, and imaginaries between immigrants and those living in the home country exemplify the transnational nature of immigrant experience today. Oromo transnationalism is not new. It is my contention that transnationalism has been a hallmark of the modern Oromo immigrant experience since the 1970s. In this paper, I attempt to discuss Oromo transnationalism through the lens of diaspora advocacy before and after Web 2.0. I seek to highlight how members of the Oromo diaspora used ethnic institutions to create a discursive space from which to imagine Oromo culture and identity in ways that were and are still not yet fully possible in Ethiopia proper. Essentially, this paper is concerned with how exiles and other types of Oromo transnationals fought from the margins of discursive and territorial space to produce institutions and a globally circulating discourse about Oromo culture, identity, and concerns that challenge the ethnic-based discrimination and assimilatory logic that has long characterized Ethio-Oromo relations. I begin with a brief introduction. Next, I discuss the push factors that facilitated the birth of the Oromo diaspora. I then explore the types of advocacy work Oromo transnationals engaged in prior to the Oromo protest movement. Finally, I discuss the Oromo protest movement and its relationships to new forms of Oromo transnationalism. So, who are the Oromo and how were they integrated within what would become Ethiopia? For those of you in the audience that are unfamiliar with the Oromo, they are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. Prior to the 19th century, the Oromo occupied southern Ethiopia, northern Kenya, and parts of Somalia. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, Abyssinia and neighboring groups like the Oromo engaged in fierce conflicts over land, influence, and the region's resources. By the end of the 19th century, however, Abyssinia was able to use her Christian ties with Europe to obtain firearms with which she used to conquer the Oromo and many other groups that were to the south of her. With the exception of a small assimilated and assimilating Oromo elite, the newly incorporated Oromo became a subordinate ethnic minority. The Semitic culture of the northern settlers became the national culture writ large. Economically, a large number of Oromo subjects were integrated into what became modern Ethiopia through a system of land tenancy whereby the state gave armed settlers grants of land and tribute-paying local peasants as payment for their participation in conquest. Ethiopia's control of the conquered areas was maintained, of course, by force, but also by a set of discourses about ethnic difference that justified Ethiopia's confiscation of Oromo territories and the forced use of their labor. Many early Ethiopian and European historical accounts of the Oromo depicted them as newcomers, enemies of the empire, as a heathen swarm with the potential to engulf the nation due to their large numbers and military prowess. Conversely, Ethiopia's Semitic speaking core was represented as a stand in for Western civilization in Africa. On a continuum between the West and Africa, Ethiopia was deemed Western by European scholars by virtue of her Christianity, monarchy, history of literacy, and purported hybridity. Within Ethiopian studies, the Oromo were represented as raw and unadulterated Africans, less tempered by Semitic civilization and blood. These discourses supported Ethiopian nationalism, the erasure of Oromo culture, the justification, and they justified the abjection and natal alienation the Oromo experienced within Ethiopia. It was these very representations and the effects of these discourses that the Oromo sought to challenge and resist with the birth of their national movement in the 1960s. Now, I want to talk to you briefly about the rise of Oromo nationalism and the birth of the Oromo diaspora. Starting in the 1960s, key segments of the Oromo population began to challenge the subordination they had experienced as a result of incorporation. During this period, Oromos living in urban areas in the central and western parts of the country participated in cultural revitalization movements like the Machatulema self-help organization that sought to revitalize disparaged aspects of Oromo culture, while Oromo peasants living in the East rebelled against economic exploitation through or by way of the Bali Rebellion. By the 1970s, Oromo descent was met with government persecution, which led to the exodus of many educated Oromos. The rise of Oromo nationalism, then, was soon followed by the birth of Oromo transnationalism. Because the political conditions in Ethiopia were so repressive and internal dissent was virtually outlawed in the country during the 1970s and 80s, and some would say even today, the Oromo diaspora became the communicative organ through which Oromo critiques and grievances were articulated globally, and they have maintained this function today. At this time, I would like to explore resistance and something I call the productivity of marginality. Within the social sciences, having a marginal status is often associated with being of little importance and, in a sense, being peripheral to the center. So why speak of the productivity of marginality? The word margin is derived from the Latin root mergo, which means end, edge, border, or brink. In its most common usage, it represents the edge of a paper that remains blank. It also signifies the edge of a flat surface. In mathematics, it is the line that defines inclusion in or exclusion from a set or group. It also represents a permissible difference, or it denotes freedom to move within limits. Finally, it is the profit a business earns. These definitions all point to using one's position on the edge of discourse and territory to create a space of opportunity, though this space is circumscribed and confined. These definitions highlight that power and oppression from the center are never total. In the Oromo case, marginality offered a space of vital significance in that it was productive or acted as a productive space of resistance over the longue durée. So now I want to talk to you all about transnational Oromo advocacy. The creation of Oromo institutions in the diaspora played an important role in the development of modern Oromo nationalism and self-making. This project has been global from its inception. Dissatisfied with Oromo invisibility within Ethiopian studies and the inability of mainstream and leftist Ethiopian organizations in and outside of Ethiopia to adequately address ethnic inequality in Ethiopia, a small but vocal subset of the Oromo immigrant community set out to create ethnic-based institutions in the U.S. and in Europe. The freedom of expression and association that life in the West afforded these immigrants was used to create global spaces of dissent from which the diaspora could speak on behalf of those that had been silenced in Oromia. They founded organizations like the Union of Oromo Students of North America and the Union of Oromo Students in Europe in the mid-1970s. These organizations were transnational in terms of their orientation, goals, and reach. By the mid-1980s, organizations like the Oromo Studies Association formed to provide more extensive academic treatment of Oromo issues. Contestations over the past are at the heart of ethno-political conflicts that are actually raging in Ethiopia today. Historical narratives have been used by the Ethiopian government to sanction state expansion. Oromo scholars living in the diaspora contributed to the Oromo struggle for equality by writing Oromo history and challenging dominant stereotypes within Ethiopian studies. They expressed their agency through discourse and played an important role in altering the way the Oromos viewed themselves and how they were viewed by Western and Ethiopian scholars. By the 1990s, the Oromo immigrant community in many major cities increased in size. As a result, many Oromo religious and community institutions were founded. Oromo advocacy has gone through two phases. Phase one, I guess you could say, takes place before the protest, and phase two um, would take place after the Oromo protest of 2014. So I want to just briefly list some of the early examples of Oromo transnational advocacy um, that typified many of the Oromo communities in major cities like Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, St. Paul, Atlanta, Georgia, Seattle, Washington, Columbus, Ohio, and other cities in California. So, just a quick list of some of the activities that they engaged in. They staged joint protests with other communities around the globe on behalf of the Oromo in opposition to the Ethiopian government and their repressive activities. They fundraised to support victims of state terror in Ethiopia, provided financial support to Oromo refugees in the Horn of Africa. The Oromo Relief Association was an early example of an organization dedicated specifically to this issue. They established the Oromo Support Group and other organizations like it to monitor human rights violations experienced by the Oromo and others in Ethiopia and in the Horn of Africa. They engaged in many letter writing campaigns in opposition to Oromo victimization. They established radio and TV programs to address the experience of both the Oromos living in the diaspora, but also the Oromo living in Oromia. They played a role in the formation of the Oromo writing system. They established Oromo internet news sites, groups, and forums that shared Oromo-related news from Ethiopia and the diaspora. And finally, they created community centers and other institutions that advocated for the Oromo in Ethiopia, assisted in the resettlement process of new immigrants, and acted as a space of socialization for the next generation. So phase two. Let's talk a little bit about phase two. And I guess it can be characterized by the rise of social media and the birth of the modern Oromo protest movement in Ethiopia. So the Oromo protest movement that began in 2014 signaled a break with past forms of resistance in that it has been sustained and widespread. It represents a kind of sustained or a form of sustained Oromo resistance that has not been seen in Ethiopia in more than a generation. Let me just give you some background on the actual protest. In 2014, the Ethiopian government announced the controversial Addis Ababa Integrated Development Master Plan, also known as the Master Plan. This plan aimed to expand the boundaries of the capital city into nearby Oromo farmlands. The proposed plan would displace thousands of Oromo farmers. The government temporarily shelved the plan due to the Oromo student protests that ensued as a result of their announcement of their proposal. However, starting in late 2015, the government expressed renewed interest in moving forward with the master plan, which ignited massive countrywide protests from all segments of the Oromo society. Today, grievances now extend beyond the master plan and express widespread and long-standing Oromo dissatisfaction with perceived ethnic discrimination, lack of proportional economic investment in Oromia, and the government's inability to allow the legitimate expression of democratic freedoms in the country. Since 2015, the Ethiopian government has killed more than 1,000 protesters and detained thousands of others in attempts to quell dissent. In October of 2016, Ethiopia issued a 6-month state of emergency, which severely curtailed mobile phone use and internet use, led to mass arrest, and limited free movement within the country in an attempt to stymie the Oromo protest movement. In late May of 2017, Ethiopia extended the state of emergency again to get a handle on the resistance movement that had taken place in the country. Though the state of emergency has been lifted as of today, conflict has not abated in the country. For instance, the government is likely implicated in the state-sponsored ethnic conflicts between the Somali and the Oromo in the eastern part of the country, and they are to blame for a recent uptick in deaths in central Ethiopia. As was discussed above, The Oromo have engaged in transnational advocacy prior to the start of the Oromo protest movement of 2014. Um, since we know this is the case, what is different about the current moment? In what ways has Oromo transnationalism changed or modified and morphed? It is my view that three factors account for the qualitative differences between Oromo advocacy or Oromo transnational advocacy in phase one and phase two. These three factors are the maturation of diaspora institutions and the deepening integration and their deepening integration within the host country, the rise of the second generation, and the rise of Oromo media outlets and the increased use of social media all help to guide our discussion of the expansion of Oromo transnational advocacy into new terrain. First, the diaspora's maturation. The diaspora is no longer composed of refugees and new arrivals. Oromo diaspora communities are more stable, larger, and have developed community institutions. These institutions were rapidly mobilized to support the Oromo protest movement in ways never possible before. Their integration into America, Europe, and Australia allowed them to use the networks they gained in these countries to ask that the host nations they occupied intervene politically on behalf of the Oromo in Ethiopia through resolutions in the EU and proposed resolutions in the House and Senate in the United States. This period marks the introduction of the second generation into diaspora advocacy. It was only recently that the second generation reached adulthood. They felt a deep connection to the protesters in Ethiopia because they were of the same age and could identify with their concerns and aspirations. Second generation Oromo youths used their social media networks and savvy to act as the first advocacy responders to the Oromo protest crisis. As a result, Oromo youths living in North America, Europe, and Australia utilized social media to bring awareness to the protests before any other group actually had captured the story. So they were important early on in publicizing the protest. The internet and social media allow for the radical opening up of alternative spaces of communication and engagement that bypass traditional channels and help to create a transnational public sphere that I call the Oromo identisphere. Protest images of pain and resistance were productive and acted as a kind of current or energy that flowed through a transnational circuit of signification and amplification that was transformative and caused the diaspora to act. The protest reawakened hope in the idea of liberation and political change in Ethiopia. The global flow of information facilitated by Facebook and Twitter and news sites like OMN, OPride, and sites like Gada.com and many others not only created spaces of information sharing, the comment sections of these spaces also allowed for the creation of powerful imaginaries that enabled transboundary political practice even when the actors involved were localized. The technologies, institutions, and imaginaries that mark the current global digital manifestations associated with the Oromo protests inscribe local political practice and practices of the Oromo in Oromia and the West with new global meaning and potentialities. Oromo activities may connect disorganized crowds and enable the formation of network publics that can be activated and sustained by feelings of belonging and solidarity. The social ordering that we all are exposed to is no longer nationally bound or centered in any single locus of coordination. The locus of governmentality is unbound, unbundled, and assigned to institutions at different scalar levels. Just as Ethiopia seeks to develop and discipline the Oromo precariat through neoliberal land grabs for the benefit of Ethiopia's elite and companies outside of Ethiopia, so too Oromo resistance is transnational and takes place at different scalar levels. And at this time, I'll end. Thank you.